I'm really passionate about people having access to energy. Energy that's cheap, energy that's abundant, energy that doesn't make them sick. That has driven my career ever since I was at university. I worked at an oil rig in Australia. I joined Boston Consulting Group and worked in the energy practice. I worked on off-grid solar in the Amazon and in East Africa. I worked at the biggest alternatives asset manager in the world, Blackstone, on energy infrastructure investments. And now I do independent advisory work with energy investors, with politicians, with the public service on how we can make energy more affordable, how we can deliver on Britain's industrial ambitions. That drives everything I do. There's lots of different ways that manifests, but it all comes back to how we can unlock economic opportunity and make our lives better with energy.
One of the things that seems to be close to your heart is coal. Which obviously we've got a sort of a history with here in Britain, but we've now stopped burning coal. What should we be thinking about in terms of sort of coal and I suppose those historic, communities, those power plants, that sort of old way in which we made energy, up until last year?
So it's interesting you say that it's an old way that we make energy. The UK stopped using coal for electricity in 2024. We were the birthplace of the modern industrial complex around coal, and we used coal to power our factories, to make all our materials, to power steam engines, transportation, all throughout our industrial history. We then exported that knowledge and know-how all around the world, to the US, eventually to China, to India. And actually, coal is the largest electricity source out of any generation source globally, even in 2026. So it's true that Britain stopped using coal, but what I find so fascinating is the rest of the world hasn't. And we have so many other technologies that can deliver energy, deliver electricity specifically, that we haven't yet been adopting at the pace needed to retire all of the coal assets that we have around the world. I find it interesting that when we talk about climate change and the energy transition, we haven't actually transitioned away from coal. We've just added a lot more on top. So if we really do intend to transition to fuels that are cheaper, fuels that are cleaner, fuels that don't have as much air pollution that then cause health problems, we really need to start thinking about how we phase out coal and what some of those structural barriers are to doing that phase out. Now, I would argue that the cost of phasing out coal isn't really the binding constraint, nor is the technology. We have so many different technologies that have come down the cost curve, like solar, batteries, even geothermal, nuclear, hydro, everything can help to displace coal. And what you really need to look at is the upstream politics for why coal is helpful to societies. It's not just an energy source. It also creates jobs. It helps countries be more secure, which is now a defense priority around the world. We use coal to subsidize the state through royalties. And some countries even own their own coal assets, so they directly benefit from any profits in the coal industry. We also use coal to win elections, not only because it appeals to voters in constituencies that might have an outsized voice at a national level.
And people have made the comparison with the oil and gas industry, right? The way in which, say, Aberdeen is being hollowed out by this transition. What is a better way of doing it? How can government, how can society try and take the edge off that incredibly uncomfortable place?
Yeah, so I'll talk a bit about what happened with the decline of the coal industry in the UK, to then talk about what we could probably do better. The UK is the only country, really, that's completely shifted away from coal, the only major coal user to have done so. And it did that through a brutal capitalist campaign led by Margaret Thatcher. She took on the coal unions And she won. She privatized the coal industry, which was unprofitable at the time. She stopped subsidizing it. And that led to market forces pushing coal out of the energy mix in favor of even imported coal, but primarily gas and then later renewables, once we'd also introduced a carbon tax. So market forces were important, but so was the political decision to let them prevail. And that decision was taken without thinking about what would happen to all these workers when coal jobs went away, what would happen to all these communities when coal jobs went away. The issue you have with the resources sector is jobs and the communities around them cluster around that resource. There may not be a reason to put other industries there, given that they were so dependent on the geography of where that resource was located. And so you need to start thinking about what else those communities could be doing that use the assets of that place before you start retiring those assets, that infrastructure, and seeing job losses accrue. We're a cautionary tale on what happens when you don't plan for the transition, when you let people free fall without a safety net and without thinking about how you can turn the assets and the capacity of communities into the economy of the future. That's what interests me in the work that I do in energy investments, because I see this massive opportunity to be repurposing our coal assets and possibly also our oil and gas assets to deliver the infrastructure that we need for the future.
So let's talk about repurposing, because I think that's a really interesting idea. And I think certainly looking at some of those old coal sites, we're seeing things like data centers pop up. What are the ways in which we need to take action to deliver that change? What do we need to make it happen?
They need to decide what will benefit the community most and what will create the most value. And that comes in many different dimensions. That could be creating jobs, it could be monetizing the asset to then spend on other services in the community. It could be a blend of those things. And I think what would help us to unlock that opportunity is, one, more support for the local authorities to understand what assets they actually have, what those assets could be converted into that would help their community, and helping them navigate the trade-offs of making the most money out of their endowment versus creating the most jobs, and what partnerships with private sector might look like if they're not able to deliver all of this investment themselves. I've also just focused here on the coal power plants, but there's a whole industry upstream from coal, which includes the rail infrastructure, the ports infrastructure, and the mines. And all of that around the world is an enormous amount of infrastructure that we're going to be looking at to retire in future. We're seeing coal mines being repurposed and filled in to then support solar installations. These incredible coalfields in China that now are massive fields of solar. We haven't done that at nearly the same scale in the UK, in part because of how our mines were closed and how they were remediated, and in part because we prefer the sight of open fields and forests to having lots of solar around. But we could be starting to think differently about how we repurpose these former assets, because we have so many more constraints now than we might have had when we closed these mines 20, 30, 40 years ago, when we closed these coal power plants. And we also have not revitalized these regional areas in the UK. This could be part of that story, and also a story that we export to other countries as they reckon with their coal transitions in the future.
And so finally, what do you think we need to change to unlock the opportunities in the energy sector?
There's so many things that could be changed about our system, and there's also lots of things that are working that we shouldn't necessarily rip up. It is quite difficult to build in this country. That's partly by design, because we want communities to have a say in what happens in their local area, and we want people to be able to block projects that aren't in their interest. And so I understand the purpose of that, but we've come to a point where it's now taking years and sometimes decades to get projects built that will benefit the national interest and aren't moving fast enough and causing cost rises. So it's easy to say we should reform planning, but we should reform planning and make it easier to get critical projects approved and offer ways that communities can have more of a financial stake perhaps in those projects, in line with what the government's proposing with the local power plan. But also helping people recognize that this is part of bringing energy costs down, and it's also part of making our country a more secure place to live where businesses want to locate. We need to tell that story better when we ask people to make compromises about planning in their local area. Another thing we could focus on is prioritizing the technologies that are actually cheapest. Solar, despite our really gloomy weather in the UK, is one of the cheapest ways that Britain can generate electricity alongside batteries. And we haven't nearly maximized the full potential of that. And these technologies can be installed without too much disruption to the local landscape. They can be put on roofs. There's a lot of brownfield land in the UK that could be used, car parks, the land next to railway tracks even. And this could go a long way to getting community buy-in if you're using land that no one else wants to use anyway for electricity generation and preserving the wonderful green fields we have for walking and for the view. I think the other thing that we focus on a lot, especially governments like to focus on this, is building, because the results are visible. You can show that you delivered something, but reforms in the back end and using technology better can actually save more money and mean you reduce the amount you have to build. And it's not as exciting politically to sell that message, but reforming our grid so that we actually pay for electricity based on the physical constraints of delivering it would be a really positive change, in my view, to actually make the market function instead of what we have today, which doesn't acknowledge that some energy can't get from where it's generated to where it's needed and ends up being turned off, and we have to turn some electricity on somewhere else that's more expensive. We could be using flexibility technologies to alleviate this challenge too, but without those market signals, those technologies are more limited in the benefits they can offer. We could be automating more. We have had an enormous campaign to install smart meters in people's homes. My home still doesn't have a smart meter, but I think more than 60% of UK homes do. And we aren't using them. So I think automation is a really big part of that we're still not capitalizing on.